course, know that safeguarding and restoring forest-based economies is a crucial global and national climate strategy. Our own research at WRI actually finds that deforestation rates are 2, sometimes 3 or more times lower in indigenous territories than in any other type of forest. And due to this expert stewardship, over 90% of indigenous peoples' lands today remain in good to moderate condition, accounting for roughly 40% of the Earth's remaining ecological intact lands. And we all know what the lands outside of that bracket look like. According to latest 10-year analyses, at least 28% of forests in low and middle-income countries are formally owned or claimed by indigenous peoples and local communities. And that's a highly conservative number, obviously. It's probably likely to be much more. So imagine, just imagine, how much these millions of hectares of community forests, if they were community managed, could be contributing to global climate action. Indeed, we might not even be here at the COPs in this precarious climate situation were that the case. So, over the past 40 years, this concept of community forest management, where forest users have some role in determining how forests are used and managed, has finally been formally recognized and promoted as a way to merge our priorities of environmental conservation with natural resource rights and economic development, the economic development agenda. But of course, there are many significant barriers that have challenged the widespread scaling of community-led forest management. These are numerous. They include the knowledge gap on the value of sustainably managed forests, the coordination gap that hinders effective decision-making among stakeholders, and of course, gap in financing for community-led activity. So at WRI, our hypothesis is that one way to address this myriad of challenges together is to focus on growing community-led forest management into a full, robust, thriving sector of economy. A sector that's designed by community, a sector that revolutionizes the very idea of what it means to be productive. A sector that shows, yes, we can create monetary value, we can create waves of jobs, we can proliferate and sustain multiple pipelines and streams of revenue. We can reinvest those revenues in the assets of ecosystem and the assets of people. A sector that shows a virtuous cycle, a positive virtuous cycle, showing that people, nature, and climate can actually work better together. In other words, our hypothesis is to focus on the vision of sustainable, inclusive, community-led forest economies. And we're not alone. Many of our partners, those of you in the room, see the same vision. And that's what brings us here today. We want to explore the question together of what it would take to truly realize this vision, not by the end of our lifetimes, but now, soon, clock is ticking. What is the investment opportunity that community-led forest economies actually represent? What are the necessary conditions required to frame community-led forest economies as an investment opportunity? How do we create investment models that can be replicated and scaled? How do we better channel existing resources in forests more directly to the last mile of the community? These are not easy questions to answer, but there's no better place to ask them than at the Climate Finance COP. And the good thing is that we have experts from across the tropical forest belt, from Southeast Asia to Central Africa to the Amazon, who have been working hard trying to answer these questions for years, here with us today to share their reflections and help us land on some concrete ideas for action. Many such experts belong to the Global Alliance for Territorial Communities, our co-hosts for today's event. So please allow me to welcome the GATC to share some opening remarks, after which we will hear perspectives from expert voices in the room, and then open up to a discussion for all of our voices, expert or not, on finance, before offering some closing reflections. Enjoy your time with us today, and most importantly, let this conversation fill you with hope. Without any further ado, please allow me to welcome to the stage Juan Carlos Gintiash, Executive Secretary for the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes con todos y todas. Creo que voy a hablar en español porque hay interpretación, ¿no? ¿No hay? Okay. So I'm going to switch in English, they say. I'm so sorry about this. Thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah. Good afternoon to everyone. Today, we gather at this important meeting organized in collaboration with the World Resource Institute, to whom we extend our gratitude along with all these present. And it's an honor for me to share this space with allies committed to building a future rooted in the climate justice, standing forests, and a vibrant communities just we envision them. My name is Juan Carlos Hintias. I am from the Shuar Indigenous Group, and I'm from the Amazon Basin. As Executive Secretary, it's an honor to present some views from indigenous organization Aman, Indonesia, Congo Basin, 8 countries, Central Africa, Repaliac, a PIB organization, not just Amazonian, all local community indigenous organization in Brazil, a PIB, Amazon Basin, 9 countries in South America, and Mesoamerica and the Caribbean, Aman organization. We all together, we are GATC. We created these coalitions about 10 years ago. The theme that brings us together today, finances community-led forest economy, is not just an economy issue. It is a matter of justice, recognition, and survival. Our forests are not mere geographical spaces. They are homes to cultures and knowledge, that beautiful traditional knowledge. And economies, they have coexist in harmony with nature for centuries from our elders. We have to shape the forests just as the forests have shaped us. However, this coexistence is under threat. Despite being the primary guardians of the forest, indigenous and local communities receive only the tiny fraction of the resources allocated to combat climate change and protect this beautiful biodiversity that is in our hands, 80%. This reflects a deep disconnect between global rhetoric and concrete action. The creation of the Shandia platform in 2021 was our response to this injustice. Since then, we have worked to channel resources directly to our communities, strengthening an economy grounded in our ancestral knowledge and our relationship with the forest. We know that priorities are how to invest resources to ensure we can continue living as we always will burn them, or master or plans or life, we call. But to achieve this, we need to move faster. Resources must reach these who truly preserve the forest. We need commitments that are more ambitious and aligned with the realities of our territories. While donors and allies move up to a slow space, we continue to face violence, land invasions, forest destructions, and dying rivers. If we are serious about staying below 1.5 Celsius degree and committed to our lives, we can no longer pretend there is no urgency. This urgency contrasts sharply with the slow growth of direct finances to our communities, as seen with the pledge made at COP26 in Glasgow. The latest, the FTFG reports stated that 79% of the 1.7 billion pledged has already been invested. While this reflects donors' efforts to fulfill the pledge, the outlook for direct investments is bleak to our resources, invested since the pledge began, only 6% has been allocated directly to all organizations. What needs to change and alter this situation? We are doing our part. Yes, the Shandia network or mechanism continues to grow, and the Shandia Forum held in New York this September demonstrate its impact and in the territories is tangible. Despite insufficient funding, by strengthening these mechanisms, Shandia amplifies local impacts and promotes innovative practices that prioritize direct and effective funding for indigenous people and local community. Now, it's essential for donors, multilaterals, to everybody to listen, to learn from our practices, instead of forcing us to adapt other models. Commitment to direct funding also means committed to decolonization, and funding structures. That is a Shandia call, for urgent call for the true climate justice. Let this meeting bring us closer, concrete, real, and visible change for our territories from elders and local communities also. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Juan Carlos, and that riveting reminder that community-led forest economy is not just about economy, it's about justice. So with those remarks, let's now move into an expert panel. Please allow me to invite up to the stage David Kaimovitz, Chief Program Officer for the International Land Tenure Facility. A round of applause for David. Balkisu Buba from Repaliak. Those of you might know Repaliak, the network of indigenous and local populations for the sustainable management of forest ecosystems in Central Africa. And Repaliak, as Juan Carlos mentioned, is the co-chair of GATC. We will also invite up Laureen Manzi. Is Laureen here? Perfect. Laureen Manzi, climate finance analyst from the Rwanda Green Fund. I'm not hearing the applause. And then, of course, Vera Ramelan, the program consultant and senior advisor from the Climate and Land Use Alliance. Thank you. Excellent. All right. So let's get going. We're going to ask a few questions about this concept of community-led forest economy. And David, I'm going to come to you first because it's not that there isn't already a movement in this direction, right? A movement towards forest management as revenue generation opportunity. There are some successful examples. There are different models. They may go by different names across the tropical belts. Could you share with us what's the state of the art? What's the best practice you're seeing so far for investing in community-led forest economies?
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you very much to World Resources Institute and to the Global Alliance for Territorial Communities to inviting us here today to talk about this issue. If we look at the general situation, up until very recently, very little funding in general was getting to forest communities. Generally, they were too remote, considered to be not productive enough to attract the attention of NGOs or governments. And conservation groups, up until very recently, tended to see indigenous peoples and local communities as part of the forest problem rather than part of the forest solution. That was kind of okay because many of these communities were managing their resources and living in peace, and things were moving along reasonably well. But in recent years, as talking to Juan Carlos in these last couple of days have pointed out, the pressures on these communities are growing very, very rapidly. The young people are finding they have no opportunities in moving to the towns because there's nothing being offered for them in their villages. The illegal miners, the illegal loggers are moving in, and they're offering the only economic opportunity that's available for people. And the pressure on these communities is growing from outside, from large-scale companies, mining, agribusiness, forestry, etc. The good news is that particularly the experience in Latin America, but also the experience in South Asia, shows that whenever governments have made a commitment to developing forest economies, community-based forest economies, there has been a lot of success. We've seen in different moments tremendous success in Mexico, which is probably the most advanced country on this, but not just Mexico. Bolivia, Peru, Honduras, Nepal, India in particular, where community forestry enterprises of different sorts have grown up and thrived with government policies. The biggest issue in almost all those cases has been continuity. The government policies have been favorable for several decades, and then all of a sudden change in ways that things get destroyed, and it's much easier to destroy a community forestry enterprise and a community forest enterprise movement than it is to rebuild it, which usually takes a long period of time. But those examples are very important because they show what's possible. Then what we see, and this is at the heart of so much of what the 10-year facility I work with now shows, is that formal recognition of indigenous peoples, of the communities, of their tenure and their territories is a precondition for taking community forestry enterprises to a different level. And that starts with the most basic thing. When I was at the GATC meeting in Cameroon last year, the issue was that the indigenous people we visited couldn't get a cédula, they couldn't get a ID card to be recognized as a human being. So formal recognition starts from the recognition by the government of being recognized as a human being. And then comes the recognition of your territory, of your land. But without that, it's very difficult to access any government services. It's very difficult to get any private company that's serious to want to come in and work with you. It's very difficult for people to access other types of services because really having some piece of paper is a starting point for making any sort of contract or formal arrangement. When I went to Amazonas recently in the Congo Basin and looked at one of the communities that's trying to get title, their struggle right now is how can we get a school, how can we get water, how can we get any government services because they don't even recognize us as a community. We're not formally recognized. And so investment needs to go into formal recognition to people as human beings, to communities as communities, and to the land and territory. And once you do get formal recognition, it opens up all sorts of doors. Our experience now in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we're working along with many other organizations and also WRI and Repaliac to get recognition of local community forestry concessions, permanent rights over 50,000 hectare areas, and to get these local community forestry concessions simple management plans, is that once you do that, it opens the possibility for new types of partnerships. We've seen the U.S. Forest Service that is willing to come in and provide investment and cooperation with these communities and local forest concessions because they're recognized and they're organized. We're seeing interest from FCDO and UK to invest in community forest enterprises, but again, they're interested because the communities are organized and because they're recognized. One issue that comes up inevitably throughout the tropics in terms of community forestry enterprises and this sort of forest economy is overregulation and overtaxation. The simple truth is to clear the forest and plant agricultural activities or livestock in the Latin American context isn't regulated by anybody. But all you need to do is try to take out some timber or to try to take out some non-timber forest products more formally and through a formal process, and it requires an endless amount of paperwork, which is a constant disincentive to work in the forestry direction, which is maintaining the forest cover, and an incentive to clear it for use for other things. So what we see in practical terms is that things have moved faster for agroforestry activities like acai in Brazil, or like cocoa in some places, or coffee in some places, because they don't have all of that overregulation and paperwork. We've also seen that most of the finance money that's getting put in goes to just doing the paperwork. It's hard to get money for actual investments in doing productive activities if it takes millions of dollars just to get forest management plans approved and paperwork, which is not bringing money into families' pockets. And we're increasingly seeing in some of the most important community forestry countries taxation. We're seeing that forest communities that used to not be taxed really at all by governments, the governments see any sort of formal community forestry enterprise, they come in, they're demanding money. When the communities can't pay the money, then they're bringing the communities to fines and these sort of things. And when the government should be subsidizing an environmentally friendly activity, instead they're not only taxing it, they're making the taxes very hard for them to pay because often it's required to put them digitally in the system when they don't have electricity, they don't have internet, they don't know how to enter even into these taxation systems that are being imposed on forest communities. In this whole context, organization is key. The Global Alliance for Territorial Communities is fundamental in that, in all of the 5 regions where they are working, to create the sort of political platforms and customary traditional platforms that can move this agenda forward. Organization is also key to develop economic enterprises, for incubating enterprises, for developing cooperatives, and for managing the very complex relation between customary traditional authority and modern community forestry enterprises. That requires funding, that requires support and recognition for the types of organization that are in the Global Alliance for Territorial Communities. And that's why these efforts that have been building around the world, first for a $1.7 billion pledge in 2021, and now we hope for a larger pledge in 2025 in COP30 in Brazil, are so important. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that, David. That was already like a little TED Talk of information. I took so much away from that. Really great to hear that examples of community-led forestry, forest enterprises exist. You said anytime a government invests in community-led forest economies, it's actually successful. The challenge is continuity. You mentioned the challenge of overregulation and overtaxation. You also mentioned some of the preconditions that themselves then act as barriers. Recognition as a human being, recognition of rights to land. So thank you for setting that landscape up for us. I want to now come to Balkisu because you mentioned the role of mechanisms that direct finance towards enterprise, David. And earlier on, Juan Carlos talked about something. He talked about the Shandia platform that some of us may or may not be familiar with. So Balkisu, I want to come to you and share with us, please, your experience with Shandia. What is working right now in terms of directing finance directly towards community-led forest enterprise?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am Balkisu Buba from the Mbororo Pastoralist Community of Cameroon. I am from the Repaliac Network in the Congo Basin and representing the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, where we are from the Mesoamerica, we have the Congo Basin, we have Indonesia, and we have Mesoamerica and the Amazon Basin. So for centuries, indigenous people have always been on the front lines, protecting and defending our lands against relentless threats. As David said, we have land grabs, we have oil exploitation, we have wildfires, we have mining and monocultures. And despite facing powerful interests armed with the vast resources, we have persisted with resilience and deep knowledge. Our survival and the survival of humanity depends on continuing this fight. Today, I bring a message from the territories that lie at the heart of the fight against climate change and biodiversity loss, and the financial commitment expected from this COP29, as mentioned, now must be shaped by on-the-ground realities, because most often we have pledges and so on and financial mechanisms that are really not shaped on the realities of indigenous people. And let me be clear. No one is closer to the lands than we, the indigenous peoples. As you know, we have that interlink with our environment and we are close to nature. Our relationship with land is intimate. We are one with the lands. We are uniquely equipped to recognize the shift in our territories, to read earth signals, as well as changing weather patterns, shifting animals' behavior, and the heart of ecosystems. We are the frontliners, and we must be heard. Not only here at COP29, but in every decision that affects our lands. The new collective quantified goals on climate finance is progressing far too slowly, and the debate continues to neglect historical responsibility of the global north for financing solutions. Solutions to climate crisis, colonial practices persist, not only between nations, but also in the treatment of indigenous people and local communities. Direct access to financing is essential for sustainable and effective solutions. Remains marginalized in these discussions. This reflects a financial system that is deeply unequal and disconnected from the realities of those who protect the world's forests. If we look into areas to invest, I say, if the $1 trillion pledged to address climate crisis are to make a difference, they must adhere to some key principles. We have direct access to funds. Indigenous people and local communities must have mechanisms to access funding directly. It must be reliable, long-term, and based on trust. We need to support indigenous governance. We know how to manage our lands and our knowledge. Funding our governance is synonymous to funding forest protection. We need to invest in women and youths. Women preserve ancestral knowledge and cultural values, while youths bring energy and innovation to sustain our work, and both must be supported. We need to be flexible when it comes to funding. Territories are dynamic and ever changing. So funding must allow us to respond with creativity and innovation, enabling us to build community-led forest economies and sustainable livelihoods. There is a way to make this work. We have experiences. To start off, you must recognize us as partners and not beneficiaries. We are leaders and protectors. Solutions must uphold our traditional knowledge governance system, and cultural practices. We need ambitious partnership with governments, multilateral and philanthropic, that advance funding and rise together. Secure land rights, protect our lives, and investments in our solutions will yield the best results. It is essential to listen to our values. Our economic models are not rooted in profit but in sustainability, guided by indigenous traditions and a holistic vision of the cosmos. They break away from traditional development concepts, focusing instead on relationship with nature. Visit our territories, witness our models, and you will see how our way of life has persisted for centuries, even in the face of violence, colonization, and imposed economic systems. We also lead by example. The Shandia platform is an initiative we created to advance direct financing, enabling our communities to shape their futures by connecting funds such as the Congo Basin Fund, the Nozantera Fund, the IPAS, Mesoamerican Fund, and the Jogata Fund. We are transforming the financial landscape to align with our knowledge and governance. Through the Global Alliance and Shandia, we recently launched a new call to action for governments, advocating for a renewed financial pledge, building on the lessons of the 1.7 billion Forest Tenure Pledge. The latest report from the Forest Tenure Funders Group showed that 79% of this pledge has been invested. Only 6% has reached our organizations directly. This highlights the needs for priorities to prioritize partnership, governance, and trust. As we look to COP30, urgent action on land tenure rights is critical. Our livelihoods and ability to create what is here called forest economies is linked to our secure land tenure. Indigenous people and local communities must have secure rights to land, protection of their lives, and recognition of their traditional knowledge. Without this, the climate crisis cannot be addressed effectively. The success of COP29 and the $1 trillion pledge depend on this. Investing in indigenous-led solutions, protecting our rights, and fostering a harmonious relationship with the earth. This is how we will ensure a sustainable future for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Balkisu, for sharing with us about the Shandia principles and the Shandia financing platform. I want to move on now to Laureen from the Rwanda Green Fund, because it's not that there isn't funding flowing towards conservation. And in fact, the Rwanda Green Fund, for those who may not know, has successfully mobilized resources for forest conservation in the Virunga Mountains and other forest regions across Rwanda. So share with us, Laureen, how has Rwanda been able to leverage conservation financing schemes to promote community forest enterprise, whether that be CBOs, community enterprises, other forms of community engagement, your experience?
So thank you, Rebecca. Just to complement on Rebecca, if anyone isn't familiar with the Rwanda Green Fund, we're actually the country platform for financing green investments in Rwanda. And sorry, can you hear me? And we've managed to access funding from multilaterals and bilateral funding, and be able to divert it towards transformative projects within Rwanda, including forest conservation in multiple areas around the country. So one of the key subject on this panel is community-led approaches to forest management. And one thing that we've tried to do in Rwanda, specifically with the Rwanda Green Fund as well, when it comes to the funding that we direct towards the different types of projects that we get, is that we've tried to center community, we've tried to make community the center of the implementation of some of these projects, because we do believe that they're the ones that have the knowledge, and we just have to leverage the knowledge, the already existing traditional knowledge in terms of forest management, forest conservation, and then we pair it up with them to be able to figure out some of the solutions that we want to see and ensure the sustainability of the initiatives that we're implementing. one of the example that I can actually think of that we've managed to implement is within the Green Gichumbi project. It was funding from the GCF. It was an integrated project that had a sustainable land management component. It had agroforestry, and to be able to convince someone to switch from practices of deforestation so that they can be able to continue their livelihood as planned, you have to figure out alternative economic activities for them. And we did it by creating cooperatives and basically also come up with economic activities such as coffee plantation within those areas, and at the same time as afforestation. So that actually allowed the communities within that area to be able to feel more comfortable with not continuing the practices of deforestation, but at the same time feeling comfortable in their livelihood continuing as planned. So really what we're promoting is if we're trying to figure out financing for conservation within an area, work with the communities, they know best, work with them, find the solutions, and then come up with a scheme for financing that actually works for them so that their livelihoods will not be affected, while at the same time ensuring conservation for those areas. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Laureen. And that example, that very concrete example of how through community cooperatives you can create the mechanism, the channel, the formalization of economic activities for communities. So that was very concrete. We're going to come to Vera, who's going to give us some other concrete examples. And I'm excited because Vera wears two hats. One, obviously, she's very familiar with the Indonesia experience. And also, as I mentioned, Vera is representing the Climate and Land Use Alliance. CLUA represents an alliance of donors committed to investment in land use and is actually the secretariat of the financing initiative, FPC, Forest, People, Climate. So, Vera, perhaps could you share with us, especially from the context of Indonesia, which I think, as David was saying, is sort of one of the countries that has seen in the past and currently successful examples of community forest economy. What are you seeing as the role for donors? What do they need to be doing differently to support forest economy? How do they play a role in unblocking some of the barriers that Balki Su mentioned from your context and your Indonesia hat as well?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rebecca. It's really an honor to be here together with the panel, with the great speakers here. I've been listening to what already said. David has provided the state of the art of this issue. But to be specific on the Indonesian context, although there are some positive steps or efforts or commitments that being made and also results. Like for example, the government committed to provide or allocate 12.7 million hectares for social forestry, giving an access to local communities to manage and areas within the forest estate, and also 9 million hectares of land ownership outside the under the agrarian reform outside the forest estate. That is one of the I think a good step that have been made. And then also looking at the deforestation rate recently that Indonesia has been successful. I think it is also received global recognition on the reduce of deforestation rate. But then there are also significant risks that we are facing until now, especially with deforestation. Recent study also revealed that the rate for the last 2 years, deforestation is increasing, especially in the eastern part of Indonesia. And then also because of the current government, because we have a transition of the new leaders in Indonesia, the current government's priority on food estate and also on the biofuel. That has also a risk to forests and also indigenous peoples. So given that we are thinking as a philanthropy, what can we do in addressing such a complex challenges or that can have a significant risk to what we've already achieved? Then one of the support that you've already mentioned actually is through the FPC, Forest, People and Climate. We believe that indigenous peoples-led economy can bring something concrete and can be the solutions, not a problem. But then support is very limited. So through this, it's unique in the sense that it is a collaborative of philanthropic organizations, civil society, community-based organizations, IPLC's groups are engaged from the very start of the developing of the strategy. And also we do fundraising, keep continuing with the fundraising. But then the strategy is developed through that collaborative processes. The aim is actually to halt and also to reverse deforestation, while also supporting the just and equitable sustainable development. And with the FPC, it is, we have at the global level, because KLUA is the host of the FPC, by the host you are playing a role in terms of leveraging the local teams of specialized experts that are mostly coming from tropical forest countries. And then also, we are also leveraging and strengthening the networks, the relationship with those organizations who are close with this issue to ensure that it reaches scale. And then also with the, at the moment, at the global level, in total, there are 9 strategies of FBC. One of them is in Indonesia strategy. As I said earlier, that it is developed through this collaboration, engagement and participation with the CSOs, local experts, and also representations of indigenous peoples. And in the FPC strategy, there are 600 experts and also CSOs and groups of indigenous peoples that are engaged in the processes. With the fund, so with the FPC fund, which we are continuing doing the fundraising to really making sure that all the money can be deployed and can be channeled to locally based organizations. At one, it's about the fund itself, that we keep doing the fundraising. The fund so far, in the context of Indonesia, we provide support directly to the Indigenous Peoples Network, the biggest one in Indonesia. First is to strengthen the network, AMAN, as already mentioned by Juan Carlos, and also for the network to be able to also deploy direct fundings to the IPLC groups as a members of the network. We also, in terms of the social forestry and customary forest, the big question is not only to get the recognitions of the social forestry or customary forest, but also the follow-up of once it is already given to the communities, it's already recognized, official designation, and then what next? That keeps being a question, and support is really needed to actually allow local communities to make use of the rights to land that they already receive in terms of providing an economic ecosystem support for restorative economy. We call it restorative economy. In other part of the world, maybe it's bioeconomy and so on. And we also provide support to, at the national level, it is pioneered by Ford Foundation that we provide support to, through the Indonesian Environmental Fund. They, in collaborations with the Ministry of Forestry, the fund that we provide to this Indonesian Environmental Fund is for the communities, locally based organizations, indigenous peoples to have access. And the focus of the fund is directed towards post-recognition or designations of customary forest and social forestry for economic development. The scheme in the Indonesian Environmental Fund, it used to be, formerly, It's just the traditional way of channeling the fund from the national government through the fund management into the local administration, and then in the local administration they will use the regional state budget mechanism, and then they pull together with other money sources from different source of funds, but then not necessarily it's sometimes difficult to ensure that it will directly, exclusively and explicitly to support the environmental actions. But then through the scheme that we are developing in the FPC with the great flexibility in terms of support, because it is a general support, the fund is the grants is given to the Indonesian Environmental Fund, but then to support the ministry's priority, which is the post-recognition and designation of customary forest. And then the Indonesian Environmental Fund, channeling the fund not through the traditional mechanism, not traditional, but old-fashioned mechanism through the government body, but it's through CSOs, what they call it as intermediary organizations. They have list of accredited intermediary organizations, and most of the accredited intermediary organizations are our partners. So through that, and the fund through the CSOs as part of the intermediate organizations, the fund is channeled to locally based organizations who wanted to access. But then it's not only the fund, we also provide support in terms of strengthening the infrastructure, we call it. We are a bit reluctant to say it as an intermediary organizations, but more as a, what do you call it, the capillars perhaps, or the regranters, because the function is not only channeling the funds, not only subgranting the funds to the locally based organizations, but actually to increase the capacity of CBOs, of indigenous peoples group, and also to provide space to connect, to share knowledge, and also to build alignment with broader networks. So we are hoping through this kind of mechanism, not only the fund, but also how the fund can be distributed and channeled through the locally based organizations, but also improving the capacity, providing space for connection and alignment. I think that is one of the role of the philanthropy, because we have kind of luxury to be flexible in terms of giving the funds, multi-years and so on. That is something from what we've learned so far are critical, and most of indigenous peoples organizations that we have been consulting with, they were asking for flexible multi-years type of funds, which we are now have the capacity to provide as a philanthropy. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Vera. Really helpful exposition of sort of what you call the post-recognition support and infrastructure that is also in a way a precondition to forest enterprise, and the role of philanthropy in supporting that space specifically, given the flexibility that philanthropy can play with. So thank you for that. So there's a story coming out here. We're hearing about the fact that there are successful examples of governments committed to community-led forest enterprise. There are examples of platforms that are explicitly mandated to direct funds to indigenous peoples networks. That's good. But we're hearing that there are some preconditions to this concept, and we need to sort of accelerate the meeting of those preconditions. We're hearing that there are post-recognition supports and infrastructure that needs to be built, and someone needs to pay for that. And then there is this element of the risks that we would need to mitigate where we do have existing or built up community forest enterprise. And David remarked, it's much easier to tear it down, much easier to destroy than to build it up. So I'm seeing a narrative start to form. We're going to thank our panelists for their fantastic interventions and open up just to see if there's maybe even one thought or comment from the audience. It doesn't have to be a question. It could be some perspective that you'd like to add to the conversation. Anything from anyone? We've got just a minute for that. All right. Now, yes, I see one hand. Do we have a microphone? Here's a microphone coming to you.
OK. OK, merci. Je me lève. Ok. Moi, c'est Abdou Youssoufa. Je suis activiste UNICEF du côté du Cameroun, à l'extrême nord. Je suis aussi coordinateur de 3W, bien entendu, The World You Want, une organisation qui fait dans la restauration des paysages forestiers et aussi on fait dans la sensibilisation et l'éducation environnementale. Ma question va à l'endroit de la financière qui est là devant nous. J'ai suivi son intervention de près et j'étais très attentionné. Pourquoi? Parce qu'aujourd'hui, nous avons des jeunes leaders, des jeunes qui ont encore du sang neuf, qui sont disponibles dans les communautés et qui s'engagent au quotidien pour pouvoir restaurer les paysages à travers la plantation des arbres, à travers les interventions de différents horizons. En réalité, le problème aujourd'hui, c'est au niveau de la perception, de la compréhension de la chose environnementale. Du moment où elle est compliquée, il faut accompagner ces jeunes qui ont déjà des expertises comme nous. Nous avons déjà quelques éléments pour que nous puissions renforcer les compétences de nos jeunes qui sont dans les communautés. D'autres n'ont pas été à l'école, d'autres ont été à l'école mais ils n'ont pas de connaissances sur la chose environnementale. Donc il faut renforcer ces connaissances-là. Mais nous avons des difficultés. Ces difficultés sont énormes. Je vous assure que des fois, nous jeunes, on demande simplement à ce que avoir les moyens pour nous déplacer, pour aller dans les communautés, c'est compliqué.
Thank you so
On
much for
demande à
that.
ce que,
Yes.
on demande même pas des moyens, c'est du bénévolat. Mais je vous assure, c'est compliqué pour descendre au fond, pour toucher du cœur même ces structures qui sont touchées.
Thank you.
Oui, pour
Thank you.
une minute s'il vous plaît. Dans ma région à l'extrême nord, nous avons la région de l'extrême nord est la région qui reçoit le plus de réfugiés venant du Nigeria et les déplacés internes suite au conflit interne arabo-mousgou. Mais je vous assure qu'avec la pression de ces déplacés et réfugiés, nos forêts ont été vidées. Nous n'avons plus de forêts et il faut l'intervention parce que ils ont transformé ces bois-là en activités génératrices de revenus. On ne s'en sort pas, donc il faut maximiser, il faut restaurer, il faut faire du reboisement, il faut planter les arbres. Mais nous sommes bloqués au niveau des finances. Merci.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that comment on capacity building and displacement and direct work with communities. We won't have time actually to answer the questions, so I will encourage you to come up to the speakers afterwards, after the session, and get their reflections on that, as our closing speaker does have to run. So the question that we want to now ask is how we bring this all together. We're now going to turn to Naoko Ishii, the professor and director for the Center for Global Commons at the University of Tokyo. And Professor Naoko is also formerly CEO and chairperson of the GEF, and she sits on the board of Climate Works Foundation, so she knows a thing or two about mobilizing finance. So Naoko, with your wisdoms, please help us summarize, reflect on what you've heard today, share your thoughts on what this would mean for practical next steps to accelerating a movement towards community-led forest enterprise. Thank you.
Very good afternoon to everyone. It's really a fascinating discussion. It's such an informative and inspiring one. Thank you so much. As introduced, I was a former CEO of the GEF, Global Environment Facility, and during my 8 years there, I fully understand, maybe I wouldn't say fully, but I try to understand that all things that are already presented, injustice, importance of the recognition, and that the service that the indigenous people have been already doing for the planetary Earth, all those important things. And that during my time, we try to do that, find a way to channel the funds directly to the community without much big success. We started something in pilot, but then the scale is very much limited. But my successor, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, seems to be much more kind of powerful, and it seems he is paving a way to scale up of this direct financing to the indigenous community. So I have a lot of hope that something which I couldn't really finish during my time. So that's one thing. But now I left the GF and I'm doing more like a professorship. I'm totally liberated from institutional, organizational that responsibility. So it gives me opportunity to think much more freely. So something already mentioned in the previous panel, current economic and financial system doesn't do justice to the nature and the people who are protecting the nature. So how can we really reform the financial or market system? So to me, it's not really $1 billion question or 200 billion, 500 million people are talking about the funding gap of the nature. But the challenge is that our current economic system, 100 trillion, doesn't really do the justice to the natural system. That is my worry. Unless we really change how the current system, financial system, started to recognize the full value of the natural capital, we continue to destroy the natural system, which is the foundation of our survival. So my challenge is not really finding 200 billion or maybe 1 billion. It's more like, is that any better way for us to address the fundamental problem of the current economic system? Maybe I can give you one example, which is actually quite close to maybe to me. I mean, I'm living in Japan now. Several Japanese forest company or pulp company do have a lot of forest in New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Brazil. Their struggle is that they have a productive forest which is going to the timber, and it's easy for them to recognize that an economic value. But there is absolutely no value that the current system can recognize for protective forest or natural forest. The productive forest is surrounded by those natural forests. What the natural forest does do is to actually create a lot of service to the productive forest, but also to the globe, the sequestration value to protect the biodiversity, to actually regulate the water cycle, and actually the people's lives. So they are asking why the current system doesn't put any economic value of the natural forest, which they own. They put the value on the productive forest, but not for the protective or natural forest. And if the current economic system appreciate the value of the natural forest, these companies can do much more investment in the natural forest. So they themselves ask the questions, how can we really reform accounting system, rating system, market regulation, and those things which support the current economic system. So now my passion is we actually created some interesting consortium or the initiative. We call it Put the Nature on the Balance Sheet. Most of the people in this community don't like it because people react that nature is priceless, nature is sacred, you are not allowed to put a price on nature. But to me, if we really want to change 100 trillion market economy, we have to find a way to put some kind of monetary recognition, monetary value to the nature. So that I'm actually talking a lot to indigenous people, community people, how we can really reform the current system so that we can recognize the monetary value of those natural system. And once we are able to reform those market system, financing system, it may be much easier for the system to recognize the value or the service you are doing so far for almost free, right? So that how can we do it? If we are do it, that forest people, indigenous people are not rewarded by their services to protect the natural system. Right now, you are fighting to get a small amount of money from the system, and it's a tireless effort. But why not the economic system can reward to those services that you are already providing? So, and also there are several examples mentioned. It's easier to think about PES, the payment for ecosystem services, and it's also easy to think about productive forest money, but it's almost impossible. It's very challenging to how to put the monetary value of the intrinsic value. How can we really value standing forest, not the timber forest? And we have been actually working on them. How can we really do it? So it's not a practical next step, but it's a kind of ambitious, goal. And there are several crazy people from accounting firms, that regulators, that standard setters, that rating agencies who actually question that the what's not working here. And also when I talk to a lot of indigenous community and local people, some of them open their heart and think about, yeah, it may be needed to put a kind of monetary value on the nature so that our economic decision making is able to take account for that natural value. So that is a kind of project we are working on. It takes a little bit of time because then how to challenge the accounting system. Accounting system is with us for years, it's a hundred or centuries. But it is also made by man or human. It shouldn't be impossible to change it. So how we can really do it? So that is a kind of thing I'm working on. It's not a practical step at all. It's a kind of longer term goal. But I think what you are doing, that an important next step kind of thing, that some of us also need to work on this crazy project to put nature on the balance sheet. So that's kind of my commitment to you. By the way, after I left the Jeff, I founded a Center for Global Commons at University of Tokyo. What do you mean by global commons? It's actually a natural system, and it has been protected by mostly indigenous people and local community, and we are not really rewarding them. So how can we really link up the UI effort and the local community-based effort to really support to the global commons, and how global community can also recognize your service and to create a kind of more, in a sense, market-based mechanism rather than fighting or begging or that. So how do we do it? So that's kind of my hope that when I created this Center for Global Commons. And I was talking to actually Winjera Matai about this local community effort to create a global narrative. So how we can really strengthen your effort at the global level. So that is also my next target. So again, thank you so much for having me. I was totally inspired. Thank you.
Thank you, Naiko, and for that reminder that even as we are figuring out how to do community-led forest economy in the short term, within our existing financial framework, we must continue to also look towards reforming the longer arc of our global financial architecture. So thank you for that. Thank you all for staying with us. I really appreciate the time that you've all taken to be here. You could have been at any other pavilion. Thank you for being here. And the exciting thing is that based after a series of consultations, there is a movement beginning to form around championing community-led forest economy. I hope you'll all join that movement. Follow WRI and GATC for more, and much more to come on the movement for community-led forest economy. Thank you. Have a good day.